The sun stood high and unseasonably bright, casting distorted shadows on the dusty trail as the four friends, Ava, Marcus, Dylan, and Hannah, began their hike. Despite the glowing warmth, it seemed that every time the trail winded between the tall pines, the wind blew a chill. At first, no one paid any attention to it because everyone was too busy thinking about leaving their familiar world behind. Only the whistle of the wind and the soft crunch of the earth under their boots accompanied them. They had been planning this trip for weeks, determined to escape the monotony of everyday life. One of the online reviews described the remote trail as atmospheric and secluded, which seemed like the perfect fit. But the moment they saw the old sign at the trailhead, its letters almost faded beyond recognition. Eva's confidence was shaken. It was smeared with grime, stretching down in lines that looked like old, dried tears. She touched Marcus's shoulder to point it out, but he brushed her concern aside with a quick laugh. "Maybe it's just rust," he said. "Maybe the sign was older than it looked." Still, Ava couldn't shake the nagging worry that swirled in her head as they took their first steps forward, deeper into the forest. Something about the light, or perhaps the lack of birds, made her feel uncomfortably small. With each step, the group approached the forest. The dense pine canopy blocked more sun than they had expected, and gloom settled between the tall trunks. The trail meandered, occasionally branching off into smaller paths that seemed to disappear into the darkness. Hannah, usually quiet, was the first to notice the silence. Their cheerful chatter faded into an uneasy silence. No birds sang. Not a single rustle ran through the bush. The absence of sounds left an oppressive weight in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. After an hour of hiking, Dylan stopped. Something shimmered at the base of a tree, a dull gray glow in the twilight. As he bent down to look, the others gathered behind him in a tense circle. It was a small metal pendant, half buried in old pine needles and damp soil. When they dug it up, they realized that it was not just tarnished. It was bent in a way that indicated that a terrible force had been applied to it. It seemed that this force had left something else behind, a strange dark stain on the trunk of the tree. Marcus leaned forward to examine it, but recoiled when he realized it was not sap. And while the others stared at the stain with bated breath, Dylan felt a prickling sensation on his skin, as if dozens of eyes were watching them. He looked around, his heart pounding. The path ahead seemed more and more unattractive. However, as if by tacit agreement, they all continued to walk forward, leaving the metal pendant and its sinister secrets behind. Unsure, fighting a pervasive sense of dread, they moved deeper into the forest, knowing all too well that something was subtly and disturbingly out of place. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to thicken around them. Streaks of faint sunlight still made their way through the treetops, but in these light spots the air was swirling, and dust or pollen particles were swirling in it. It seemed as if the forest floor itself was watching them, layers of moss and pine needles hiding countless secrets. In the corners of her vision, Ava caught glimpses of movement, small moving figures that disappeared when she tried to focus. She couldn't tell if they were animals or just a play of her imagination, but every time they passed by, her heart pounded in her chest and she tried to calm down. As they rounded a sharp bend, the undergrowth rustled to their left. The sound was too heavy to be a bird or a squirrel, and even Marcus, who prided himself on his steadfast nature, stopped halfway. They exchanged anxious glances, each suddenly aware of how thin the walls of trees were between them and whatever might be hiding unseen. Slowly, Dylan bent down to pick up a large branch, his eyes scanning the thicket. Nothing moved. The group waited, ears perked up. Then, as if in response to the collective tension, a low moan echoed through the pines, a hollow, long groan that made my skin crawl. It sounded not quite human, but not quite animal either. Hannah's throat tightened with fear. She snuggled closer to Ava, the two of them standing an inch behind Marcus and Dylan, as if that might actually protect them from whatever was coming. They continued to walk forward in tense silence, each step seeming more dangerous than the last. Eventually, they came upon a small clearing, strangely circular, with the ground covered with swirling patterns of flattened grass. In the center were rough stones forming an uneven circle around a blackened pit. It looked as if someone had built a fire here once, but whatever had burned had left behind disturbingly shaped lumps, twisted pieces that could have been bones, though none of them dared to look too closely. An inexplicable stench hung in the clearing, something sickly sweet, sweetened by burning decay. Despite the fact that daylight was hanging overhead, it seemed that this place was in eternal twilight. A sickening wave of fear swept through the group, and no one dared to speak. Something told them that words or any sudden noise could draw attention to their presence. Moving in cautious unison, they skirted the edge of the clearing, not wanting to cross this bizarre arrangement. It was as if there was a boundary here, an invisible threshold that they instinctively knew they should not cross. Their eyes darted from tree to tree, shadow to shadow, looking for any sign of an observer, a stalker, or perhaps something much worse. Before they left the clearing behind, Ava saw a figure moving in the distant darkness. It looked tall and strangely proportioned, with a posture that defied simple understanding. She opened her mouth to warn the others, but when she blinked, the figure was gone. Her heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the trees, trying to force her eyes to adjust. The only evidence of what she had seen or thought she had seen was the faint imprint of fear coursing through her veins. She felt the urge to urge them to turn back, to abandon the hike and return to safety. But how could she explain something she wasn't even sure about? Instead, she pressed her lips together and silently followed Dylan, Marcus, and Hannah into the next section of the forest, the invisible presence of that tall silhouette pressing on her mind like a silent, unspoken warning. With each step, the forest seemed to grow heavier, as if the trees themselves were pressing closer. The silence that surrounded them turned from a curious absence of noise to something quite ominous. From time to time, a gust of wind would fly by, rustling the branches, and for a moment it sounded almost like voices, a quiet, hushed whisper that didn't speak a language the friends couldn't understand. Each whisper was like a warning. Yet, perhaps driven by a perverse fascination or simple distrust, they continued onward, determined to uncover whatever dark truth was hiding in this remote forest. Gradually, the path underfoot became more and more unstable. Exposed roots and stones sticking out from under their feet forced the group to slow down, and the thickening darkness made the trail more and more difficult to follow. Marcus took the lead, using the flashlight on his phone to light the way, though the pale beam barely penetrated the thick shadows. Ava stayed close behind him, her eyes blinking anxiously at every flicker of movement. Dylan lingered behind, his makeshift weapon, a broken branch, clutched in his white knuckles. Hannah stayed in the middle, eyes wide open, as if she couldn't decide which direction would be safer. It was near dusk when they saw something through the trees, a faint glow. At first, they thought it was the setting sun coming through a gap in the canopy. But when they got closer, they realized that it was too warm, like the light of a lantern. The glimmer of hope they felt finally, perhaps, some kind of shelter, was soon crushed by a new wave of anxiety. Who could live in a place like this? Or worse, what could be waiting for them there? They came to a small clearing and saw the remains of an old hut. Its once sturdy walls had collapsed in places, and the wood was damp and cracked from time to time. However, a shimmering orange glow shone from inside. No one spoke as they approached. Even breathing was risky, as if any sound might provoke the dark presence they sensed in the trees. Marcus hesitated on the threshold, shining the light of his phone on what was left of the hut's interior. A single oil lantern stood in the middle of the floorboards, its flame dancing erratically. There were muddy footprints scattered around it, leading in confusing circles, as if someone had walked around in excitement or panic. It smelled like rancid mold and something else that was hard to identify, a smell that made Ava's stomach twist and Hannah press her hand to her mouth with a trembling hand. Broken glass glistened on the floor. The table at the back wall was overturned, one of its legs broken off. For a long moment, the friends stopped at the door, weighing their options. Stepping inside was like stepping into a trap, but turning away meant returning to the alien darkness of the forest. In the end, their curiosity and desperate need for any shelter won out. One by one, they pushed their way inside, the rotten floor groaning under their weight. Dylan ran his palm along the wall to steady himself, His fingers felt something wet and sticky. When he pulled his hand away, he winced as he saw a dark stain on his skin, a sticky substance that looked disturbingly like thick, congealed blood. Hannah stifled a gasp. Instinctively, she grabbed the lantern, raising it higher to give a wider light. At the same moment, the flame hissed as if fighting for air, casting wild shadows on the walls. Against the backdrop of one beam, they saw a dark shape, roughly the size of a man, but distorted in a way that defied logic. It looked like a black spot, as if someone's silhouette had been burned into the wood. The sight evoked a muffled sense of horror. Ava's pulse pounded in her ears as she remembered the tall figure in the forest, the disturbing presence she had glimpsed in the clearing. Was it connected? A sudden impact interrupted their thoughts. Something, or someone, struck the outside of the hut wall. The whole structure shook, and part of the roof creaked ominously overhead. Marcus spun around, waving the light of his phone in the direction of the nearest window. Its glass had been shattered, leaving only a gaping square of darkness. In that black square, he could have sworn he saw the edge of a pale face. It disappeared so quickly that he wondered if it was a trick of the dancing lantern light. An uneasy tension gripped everyone. No one dared to speak more than a whisper. The friends gathered close together, peering at every exit, every broken section of the wall, not knowing where their invisible guest might come from. Something was out there. They could feel it, like a tangible weight pressing down on the cracked boards of the hut. It could try to break through at any second. And with each heartbeat, this horrible thought tightened its grip, until the four of them wondered if they would be the next dark spot on the wall. Slowly, as if guided by an invisible hand, Hannah lowered the lantern to the floor of the cabin. They had to decide whether to fight or flee. Without warning, the flame danced higher and released a flash, causing them all to start. The space grew brighter for a moment, illuminating the single door at the back of the cabin, half hidden by the remains of a collapsed shelf. It looked warped, as if someone had tried to push it through from the other side. Marcus slowly approached the battered door, each step making the rotten boards groan under his feet. Whatever was outside, it was pounding on the wall again in impatient, almost mocking thud. Ava felt her blood run cold. This place was not a safe haven. It was like a lair, and they were uninvited guests who had just realized that a predator was already circling them. She met Dylan's eyes. They didn't need to speak to convey the same question that was pulsing through their minds. What have we gotten ourselves into? And, more importantly, how do we get out of here? A deafening roar thundered through the walls of the ruined hut, sending a cascade of dust from the rafters and prompting the friends to flee. Marcus found a secret door in the back of the main room, its handle stiff from years of neglect. He pushed it open with his shoulder, letting out a strained groan as the warped wood and rusted hinges gave way. Ava clutched Hannah's wrist, and the two of them stumbled after him into the pitch-black corridor. Every breath brought a foul stench, a mixture of old rot and damp earth that stuck in their throats. Behind them, Dylan held a broken branch, his heartbeat drumming in his ears, ready for whatever might jump out of the darkness at any moment. The hallway led to a narrow staircase that descended to what could only be the basement. The weak beam of Marcus's cell phone flashlight shivered on the slippery, moldy walls. Each step groaned under their weight, and more than once they stopped, convinced they could hear something scraping against the wood behind them. Finally, they reached a cramped earthen chamber. The earthen floor was uneven, covered with stagnant puddles that reflected tiny glimpses of light. The air here seemed denser, suffocating in its heavy silence. Hannah picked up the lantern, and its light revealed a nightmarish sight. Scattered bones and not just animal remains lay in haphazard piles against the walls. Broken chains, torn clothing, and mangled metal pendants stuck out from the wreckage. The sight made Dylan's stomach twist. It looked as if a horror collector had thrown his horrific trophies out here to rot. Ava put her hand to her mouth, her eyes filled with tears. This was no ordinary basement. It looked like a crypt, a hidden chamber of unspeakable acts. Suddenly, a soft crunching sound came from a tunnel carved into the far side of the basement. It was a rough hole in the ground, dark and damp, as if an animal had burrowed in and decided to keep digging. In an instant, they saw something move. A tall, disturbingly thin figure partially slipped into the lantern's light, its limbs too long, its skin tightly wrapped around its emaciated body. Its eyes reflected the flickering light with a wild intelligence, and its hissing breath escaped its cracked lips, carrying unmistakable hunger. In unison, they ran. Their only chance was to go back up the stairs and hope that there was another way out. The creature was moving faster than the mind could explain, its bony hands scraping at the wooden supports and pounding the walls in pursuit. Its screams, almost human, but horribly distorted, grew louder and louder, echoing off every surface. By the time they jumped back out into the hallway, the monster was on their heels, so close that Hannah could feel its hot breath fanning the back of her neck. It was Ava who spotted the second exit, another door half hidden behind overturned boxes and a rotting bookcase. With trembling hands, she pushed open the wreckage while Marcus and Dylan tried to keep the creature at bay. The beast lunged, its needle-like claws clawing at Marcus's arm. He roared in pain. Dylan swung the branch wildly, connecting it with a fleshy blow to the monster's chest. The blow caused it to recoil for a second, just enough time for Ava to yank the door open. A blast of cold air assaulted them as they flew up the slope behind the cabin, the ground covered in a tangle of thorny undergrowth and slippery moss. It was now night, and the moonlight only illuminated the menacing shape of the forest. Somewhere behind them, the monster let out a furious scream, the sound so sharp it felt like a physical blow. They ran down the slope, branches slapping them in the face and tugging at their clothes. Through the darkness, they saw the glint of water. They broke through the line of bushes and found a wide, sluggish river. The dark water reflected the faint glow of the moon, and unknown debris swirled on its surface. Hannah, half lifting Marcus, who was struggling to stay on his feet, gestured desperately for the others to continue along the bank. But the creature burst through the undergrowth with a sudden onslaught, its pale arms waving like the bleached branches of a dead tree. With terrifying speed, it leapt at Marcus, knocking him to his knees. His scream tore through the cold air. Hannah screamed, lifting the lantern with a trembling hand. With adrenaline coursing through her, she smashed it against the monster's head and shoulder. The lantern shattered, oil splashed, and a moment later there was a chaotic flash of fire. The beast let out a scream so piercing that it seemed to echo throughout the forest. It recoiled, throwing itself at the flames that licked at its flesh. Dylan rushed forward, pulling Marcus from the monster's grasp. Eyes wide with terror, Ava grabbed Marcus's strong arm, and the group ran along the riverbank. Behind them, the creature's screams reached a crescendo, punctuated by the popping and crackling of burning oil. Though their hearts pounded with fear, hope sparked within them. If it was busy trying to put out the flames, maybe, just maybe, they could get far enough away to escape. They kept running until the trees began to thin out and the first pale glimmers of dawn flickered on the horizon. Finally, they reached a gravel road. Exhaustion hit them all at once, a numbing fatigue and a sense of how close they had come to a fate worse than death. Marcus fell to his knees, clutching the wounds on his chest. Hannah and Ava knelt down next to him, trembling hands covering the wounds in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. Dylan stood guard, battered and bruised, scanning the forest floor for any sign of the monster's return, but all was quiet. The only sounds were their heavy breathing and the distant trickle of water from the river. They would have run away, but it was a wound that would never truly heal. Somewhere behind them, in this cursed forest, the cabin stood like a rotting monument to the horrors they had witnessed. Half-human screams, a crypt of bones, and a tall, bony figure haunted their thoughts. Every step away from this place carried the burden of nightmares, which were guaranteed to surface in every dark corner and in every echo of the wind that walked through the lonely trees. The four friends clung to each other in the faint morning light, marked by a terror that few could understand. But they knew one fragile truth. They were alive even if part of them would be lost forever in this forest.